welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We are so excited to have you here with us today. And we'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about Bitcoin, and then we'll have some questions for you.
Sure. So thank you for the introduction. I had this introduction prepared, and now I don't really, I don't have to say anything. It was a much better introduction than I would have given myself. So I appreciate that, Kathy. But a little bit about me that I would add to that is I did kind of get into, I was into cybersecurity kind of back in the mid 90s. Although, at that time, I think I was more focused on how to get free phone calls from the middle school cafeteria payphone or something like that. And how that plays into all of this and how I kind of got into Bitcoin is Bitcoin's not a new idea. The people that I was hanging with and talking to back in the mid 90s were actually already talking about Bitcoin. And so as we kind of go along, I'm going to kind of give the history of not just Bitcoin, but the history of money and banking and the history of money and banking in the United States, kind of boiling it down from, maybe 65,000 years of human history to a couple thousand years of human history to a couple hundred years of human history, which is where the United States kind of and the Constitution comes into play, and the last 100 years of monetary history, which is kind of where the Federal Reserve Bank intertwines into the United States and the Constitution and a constitutional amendment. And then, maybe the last 20 or 30 years, 10 years, and we just, what's the future of money and banking and stuff. So I kind of got into, it ended up being kind of a perfect storm for me because my dad was an IBMer and was like, here's a computer, here's a code book, learn how to code or all that kind of stuff. And so I kind of started hanging out with a lot of these people. And in college, I was originally a computer science major. And at that time I had started working on my own business, and I kind of got more focused on that and less interested in I don't know, coding C on a SSH terminal through Unix System 5 or something like that. It just didn't really interest me. And I fell in love with economics, and I didn't realize that, a decade later that it would ultimately, these two things would kind of clash. I ended up doing my thesis during my graduate studies here on Bitcoin. I was working on my master's right here when Satoshi Nakamoto released the white paper for Bitcoin. And so at that time, it was just this kind of toy. And I kind of became a thorn in the side of a lot of my professors here at UTA when I was working on my graduate studies. And they, again, it was kind of a toy. It was just this kind of a joke in the econ community, I think, at the time. And slowly but surely, I have pressured Dr. Crowder to help me develop. So the two of us have developed, so that this is the first semester, we developed the Bitcoin class here at the University of Texas at Arlington, and it's kind of in the preliminary stages, and it'll kind of go into full swing next semester. So right now, all of our students are kind of helping us test run that course right now. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is like a semester. I'm going to try my best to cram a semester worth of information into the highlights, right down into like 45 or 50 minutes or something like that. So if anybody wants to reach me afterwards, really what I'm going to do as we go along is I'm going to try and give you some references of things that you can read, reliable sources of information for people who want to dive deeper into the subject and have a better grasp than the average talking head. There's a lot of, cousins, brothers, best friends out there that are crypto and NFT experts suddenly, and the question is where do you get reliable, good information? And somewhere that's not going to, steer you wrong. So as we go along, I'm going to kind of name drop a couple of different books. And the first one I'm going to drop is this one by Saifuddin Amaus, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. It's called The Bitcoin Standard. And this is a crash course in Austrian monetary theory and the history of money and banking and Bitcoin all wrapped up into one. And it's a very simple, short, easy book to read for the layman and the average person. If I had 30 seconds to recommend one thing that people go read to actually understand and be able to competently come out on the other side, probably knowing more than the average college professor on the subject, go read The Bitcoin Standard. And I'll kind of leave that here as we go along. I believe he is a, Saif is a, hails also, admittedly, from the Austrian school of thought. So very big into a lot of things that coincide with the Constitution, protection of private property, right? Understanding inalienable, unalienable rights, but also something that kind of differs from where the Constitution. So Adam, I strongly suggest you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That book was written in 1776, right? And obviously the founders of this great nation have read that book. So the Wealth of Nation actually has a couple of chapters on the history of money and banking. So some of what I'm going to talk about today is in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and a lot is covered in this book, The Bitcoin Standard. So I believe he was originally a professor at the Yale. He has since given up that position, I believe, to write more of these books and to kind of practice what he preaches, and that is to add actual value and to the educational arena. So highly recommend this book. It is written from an Austrian standpoint. It is going to get into time preference and unalienable rights and kind of private property rights. The one thing that differs with Austrians is from probably a lot of constitutionalists is Austrians do not believe in intellectual property. That is that ideas are not property. Property is property. So a little bit more constitutional stuff. Private property is private property. This computer that I'm using today is my private property. The land that I live on and I'm actively maintaining is, and the structure especially on it, is private property. But my ideas are not private property. And I can attempt to protect those ideas. I can attempt to protect my supply chains and things of that nature. And I have the right to do so. But an idea is not, without the state, and by state I mean government, private property. And so Saif actually helped pirate his own book. I'm sure the publisher was not very thrilled about that, but I highly recommend you pay for it, because it does go to supporting Saif. But he does practice what he preaches, and if you go follow his Twitter, he actually helped people pirate his own book on his own Twitter feed. So Adam Smith speaks, a lot about like the Wealth of Nations. It's actually the longer name of that book is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In other words, why do some nations get ahead and other ones fall behind? And largely that's protecting a lot of what's in our Constitution, right? Is the recognition of inalienable rights. And inalienable rights do not, an entitlement requires somebody else to forego a right? Private property must be taken from one person to give another person to support an entitlement. A right, life, liberty, and property, that is to live, to freely move about, exchange goods and services and ideas, and to own property, does not require anyone else to forego property. So anyway, I highly recommend you read this book. There's a 12-hour audio book, and it will pretty much tell you everything you need to know. So why are we here? What is Bitcoin? There's so much I would like to say on the subject, but I'm going to do the best to not ramble too much. So Bitcoin is the world's first decentralized digital currency. World's first decentralized digital currency. It's not the world's first decentralized currency. If you read this book, they'll talk about several different forms of currency that have existed before, some of which even existed as ledgers, much like our dollar currently does. And some of them were decentralized. The rye stones in Asia, there's a reason he chose these three images on the book. He starts with the rye stones because this rye stone is actually a public ledger. Herds of cattle, things of that nature, were publicly recorded onto a public ledger, transferring ownership of property, usually large things like herds of cattle and things like that, from one owner to another. And they were done so publicly, so it would be very difficult for anyone to question who was the rightful owner of that property. So it's not the world's first decentralized currency. It's also not the world's first digital currency. Obviously, the dollar even though the Fed is throwing around buzzwords, Federal Reserve Bank is throwing around buzzwords right now, saying, oh, we're going to create a digital dollar. The dollar has already been digital for several decades. It exists as a digital ledger, a centralized digital ledger. It's a digital ledger that records, at the Federal Reserve Bank, they're really more keeping track of which member banks have what account balances stored at the Federal Reserve Bank. And then if you say, go to Wells Fargo or Bank of America or any other bank, they have a ledger. It used to be a paper ledger, but for the last 40 or 50 years, last 40 years especially, my dad used to work on these big banking computers. And that at the same time, if you're old enough to remember, when you went down to the bank, they recorded everything in a paper ledger, who had what balances. And then they were also typing it into the computer because those were very early systems and they didn't really trust them yet. These days, you don't go down to the bank with, back in my day, we had a bank passport book, right? You went down and you wrote on the bank passport book and they wrote your balance, your account balance, and they signed it and stamped it for you, right? So that both of you had a copy of, and you knew how much your balance was. These days, you just digitally log into Wells Fargo. And when you do that on online banking, what you're looking at is just a ledger. And that ledger says Brandon has, $20 in his bank account. And when he writes a check to Bill, it debits his bank account and it credits another one. It's digital. It's just a digital ledger. So Bitcoin is not the world's first decentralized currency, and it's not the world's first digital currency, but it is the world's first decentralized digital currency. And what that means is it allows cash-like payments. And I use that word very specifically, cash-like payments from one person to another without the use of a trusted third party or central bank, meaning it is, for all intents and purposes, permissionless. I can send Bitcoin to someone else, or they can send it to me, or Bob can send it to Kathy, without a trusted third party and without permission across any geopolitical border in the world. And we'll get to, a lot of people are like, well, what if the internet isn't available, or what if it doesn't exist? What if they shut down the internet or something like that? We'll get to those later. I don't know that I have enough time to cover all the zombie apocalypse cases right now. But if we have time at the end, I can discuss some ways in which that's not really as much of an issue as a lot of people think it is. So basically, it allows a cash-like payment. Now, the reason I say cash is because you hear a lot of people talk about moving into, I think a lot of our listeners would be interested, they hear buzzwords going around about moving into a cashless society, something more like the direction that China is moving with their social credit system. In other words, your ability to travel and to ultimately how much food you're allowed to buy or how many video games you're allowed to play by the government will be eventually, probably, at least if they had their way, completely tied to a currency. In other words, they will use that currency to determine which behaviors are publicly or socially acceptable and how much of them is acceptable. Are you eating too many M&Ms? Well, the government thinks you are, so we're not going to let you buy M&Ms anymore or whatever, So Bitcoin, it's important to note that Bitcoin is actually the antithesis of that. Bitcoin is a permissionless cash-like payment system. It is digital, but nobody controls it. Not the miners, not the users. There is no CEO of Bitcoin. And if you lose your Bitcoin, by the way, you can't just call up the company of Bitcoin and say, hey, I lost my Bitcoin, I need you to reimburse me. It doesn't work that way. Bitcoin is actually very much like gold. Okay, so Bitcoin is really, and some people would say, gold 2.0. Bitcoin is the world's first decentralized digital currency that allows cash-like payments between two parties without asking permission of a government or a bank or a clearinghouse, okay? And it's not a new idea, okay? There have been a couple of attempts, we'll dive into a couple of different attempts in fairly recent history, the Liberty Dollar and the Liberty Reserve. And I'll kind of explain these a little bit more in detail as we get along, but the Liberty Dollar was a private currency that attempted to take on deposit gold and silver and issue a private banknote. And I'm going to explain the history of gold and how we got to banknotes here in a second, but it did not end well. Okay, it was a private currency. All they did was take on deposit in a warehouse gold, silver, and platinum, and they issued private banknotes or credit backed by that gold. And our federal government did not take kindly to that. The individuals who started this currency were charged with espionage and conspiracy and counterfeiting and a number of other crimes, and they ultimately are probably still doing jail time for all I know. I haven't checked up on it recently. The other one is more like what Bitcoin has actually solved, and it's called the Liberty Reserve. In fact, it was one of the very first on-ramps to Bitcoin. If you wanted to buy Bitcoin back in 2009 or 2010, there was a company that was allowing people to fund accounts with the Liberty Reserve. And the Liberty Reserve was simply the exact same thing. They were taking on deposit gold, and they were a central bank that was issuing a private digital currency. Basically, it was in direct competition with the dollar, basically, but it was actually backed by commodity money, gold. And this also did not end well. This particular individual had given up his citizenship in the United States about 10 years prior. He had moved to Costa Rica. He had started this company. He was a sovereign citizen in Costa Rica, and our government did not like it. And they pressured the Costa Rican government to pluck him out of Costa Rica, where he was not violating any Costa Rican laws or anything of that, and extradited him to the United States to try him in US courts. This did not end well for this individual. So clearly our federal government wields a lot of power in this department, and they do not like anyone challenging their power of seigniorage or their ability to control the money supply. If you go and print up a $100 bill, you will go to jail. If the government prints up a $100 bill and spends it, they do not. So clearly there's something going on there. So let's go a little bit back into history and figure out where Bitcoin came from and why does it have value. And as we go along, let's talk about how that kind of intertwines with some history of money and banking in the United States. So Bitcoin, what we really need to define is what is money and what gives money value. There's a lot of confusion here. There's a lot of disinformation here. People write Bitcoin off as a speculative investment. It's a toy, it's a joke. First they laugh at you, right? So why does Bitcoin have money? Why does Bitcoin have value? So if you have let's see here. I'm going to come back to some of these resources I have saved here. So Bitcoin is actually really easy to use. You can actually get into it pretty quickly. You should go to, if you want more information, you should go to bitcoin.org or bitcoincore.org, not .com. Let me repeat that, because the .com has been hijacked by another project. I don't have time to get into the he said, she said of this debate that's been raging over the last couple of years, but bitcoin.org for more information, and bitcoincore.org and bitcoin.org, not .com. And there you can download a wallet, you can start using it, and it's pretty much just like using any other online digital banking that you're already accustomed to. It's really not that hard. And there you can find other resources on where to buy it. I'm not here to tell you to buy it. I'm not here to tell you where to buy it. I'm not here to tell you how to invest. I'm not a certified financial advisor or anything like that. I'm just a monetary theorist, okay? And so I study, why does it have value? And so the reason it has value is because it performs a set of functions, okay? And so anything can be money, really, okay? But what is money, what becomes money, what is widely used as money, adheres to a small set of functions, and it does it better than any other thing, okay? So 65,000 years. The reason I'm choosing that, go read some Rothbard, go read some Hans Hermann Hoppe. If you have a chance, read Hans Hermann Hoppe's A Brief History of Mankind. It's like a 2-hour audiobook. It's really easy to read. It's a praxeological or study of human behavior, basically human action. And it will help you kind of understand some of this. And he focuses on the last 65,000 years of human history. And the reason we choose that point is cognitive ability to what we have right now is fairly similar. Use of tools, language, and kind of slow but sure trade. We begin animal husbandry, you know, the raising of livestock and crops and things like that. And certain cultures are still engaging in hunting and gathering, and other cultures are slowly moving towards the direction of growing crops and animal husbandry. And basically, if you're growing crops, right? We as humans attempt to engage in what's called consumption smoothing throughout our lifetimes. We need to, sometimes we work to produce things of value, and other times we need to consume those things, and those aren't at the same time. And so money in its most basic form, right, is a tool. It's a human tool that solves this problem. If you were stuck, the thought experiment I use for my students is, if you're stuck on a desert island, or if you're stuck out in the middle of the Wild West, how do you store value, right? There's no money, you don't have any other people to trade with. What you do is you grow crops or you raise livestock, and then you develop means of storing that for future consumption, because you can't consume an entire cow or a crop at the same time. So we as humans develop these tools of canning goods, right? Beer, right? Things that wouldn't go bad, like liquids that we could drink. It's practically what got us across the ocean, is things that wouldn't develop bacteria, right? So how do we store food that won't kill us when we want to consume it 6 months from now, right? So we started canning goods, we started salting meats, preserving meats, and things of that nature, right? And what we as humans over time realize is that some of us have better skills than others, right? So some of us are better at growing crops, and others are better at, say, hunting or raising livestock. And so this leads to specialization of trade. And we as a society realize we can be more efficient, more productive, if we are able to, that we're able to produce more collectively, if we engage in these specialization of trade. But the problem that we run into is we also have unlimited wants, right? I don't just want to eat corn all of the time. Even though I'm the best person at growing it, sometimes I'd like to eat beef or deer meat or something else, right? So I need to trade. And the first function of money needs to be some form of what we call a medium of exchange. And a medium of exchange simply solves these 4 problems. They're coincidence problems. We need a third good. The problem is, if I go to exchange, say, beef for my corn, my crops, we may not have, both people may not have what other people want. I want the beef, but they don't want the corn. So this first coincidence problem is called a coincidence of wants. The other problem would be 2 people have to be in the same place at the same time who actually want to trade. This would be a coincidence of space. A coincidence of time, similar problem, is that 2 people at the same time want to have to trade. And then finally, some coincidence of quantity. That is, we need to have quantities that are conducive to actually facilitate the trade, okay? So in other words, medium of exchange is just a third good that both parties want to trade for that facilitates trade. And the first lesson in economics is trade good, no trade bad. Praxeology, study of human action, tells me that we trade because we are better off. 2 people get together and they exchange goods and services and ideas with each other because they are both better off. They don't do it because they're worse off. So when I call you up on the phone and we chat about nonsense or whatever, we exchange those ideas because we enjoy each other's company. We're better off. In other words, humans don't engage in action reflexively, like a sneeze. They engage in action purposefully. They do things for a reason. Now, sometimes it's difficult to know what that reason is, right? But they do things for a reason. So when we trade, we are better off. When we exchange ideas, we are better off. Our founding fathers knew this, by the way. They understood, they had read Adam Smith, and they realized these nations that make it very difficult for people to trade tend to not excel. And these nations that promote trade tend to excel. They tend to get ahead, right, over hundreds of years. So it's why when you go to some countries, it looks like they're in a time capsule, right? When you go to communist Cuba or whatever, or you go to communist countries that make it very difficult for individuals to engage in the exchange of ideas and goods and services, this is why they look like they're in a time capsule, because they can't. It's trade is so incredibly difficult. So money, we need a money that makes trade more efficient. So over time, different monies get ahead and different monies fall behind. So the medium of exchange is the first function. The second one is a store of value. Okay. Now, anything, as I said, anything can be money. A lot of people who live along the coast may eat fish. In fact, fish could be money, but fish has another function. It's got intrinsic value. I can do something with it other than use it as money. I can eat fish, right? It provides calories that are much needed. The problem with fish is that if you've ever bought it at the grocery store, within about 3 or 4 days, it goes bad, right? So fish is not what another function, store of value. It's a terrible store of value. So fish is it has great intrinsic value, but it has a terrible store of value. Meaning I could, as you know, if anybody's ever bought a tuna steak, it's one of the most expensive things you can buy at the grocery store, right? I could work really hard, produce a lot of value in exchange for a tuna steak, and then a couple of days later, my tuna steak is bad, and all of that value I created just wiped out, right? And then another one would be a unit of account. Fish is also not a very good unit of account, because a unit of account would be, usually I ask my students, how much does a Honda Civic cost? Jewel, how much does a Honda Civic cost?
Honda Civic, 24,000 maybe.
All right, great. You just pulled that number right out of your head. Boom. How much is a Snickers bar cost?
At this convenience store in front of me, about $1.99.
Boom. It's funny how you pulled those two numbers right out of your head, right? And the reason I make students do that is because they're used to using the dollar as a unit of account. In other words, like I can very quickly and accurately predict kind of like how much something will cost. Fish is not a very good unit of account, because two fish, there's another term that we used, it's called fungible. One fish does not equal one fish. Fish, one might be of higher quality, better taste, things like that. So medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account, these are the big ones, right? The other ones would be fungibility, intrinsic value, is it liquid? Some people would tell you it's legal tender. Okay, legal tender is not a necessary function of a currency for it to be money. In prison, cigarettes and ramen noodles are money. Neither of those things are legal tender. In prison, those things are what serves these functions of money the best. They are a medium of exchange. Everybody in prison, many people in prison want cigarettes and ramen noodles. It's a good store of value. Cigarettes and ramen noodles don't typically go bad very quickly, and they're very easy to use as a unit of account. I'll do that favor for you for 13 cigarettes. 1, 2, 3, 4, they're almost all identical, that kind of thing. So different people use different money throughout history that solves these functions the best. And a term that I want to introduce is hard money or sound money. And hard money or sound money, or the soundest money, is what serves these functions best than anything else over time. So very quickly, people who have held soft money throughout history, for using slang term that we use in the Bitcoin community, have gotten wrecked. Okay, so if you hold soft money when other people hold hard money, you will get wrecked. And I'll explain this very, very easily. When I was a kid, Pogs were currency. Anybody here know what Pogs are? Kathy, you played Pogs as a kid? Go look up Pogs if you don't know what they are. I'm going to start a trend. We're bringing it back. The 90s are coming back anyway, right? So Pogs were a little game. They were little milk cat bottles, and you had little slammers, and you know, it was the closest thing to a dice game, I think, in middle school. That, you know, it was basically gambling without your teachers knowing. And you bought things from each other. You traded with Pogs. Pogs were basically a currency. And companies realized very quickly that Pogs were popular again, and they hyperinflated the Pog supply. Same thing happened to comic books. And if you remember Beanie Babies, they were the exact same thing. People practically there's a funny picture. If you Google it on Google, there's a divorced couple separating out their Beanie Babies during their divorce. And it's probably $1 million worth of Beanie Babies at the time. They've got them all spread out across the courtroom floor. It's kind of, and these things were basically like tulips. So oftentimes Bitcoin gets called a tulip. There was a tulip craze. There was a Dutch tulip craze. I want to say it was like in the 1600s. I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically tulip bulbs became a currency. The problem with any currency, now they did serve as a medium of exchange, a reasonable store of value, not a great unit of account or whatever. And like anything else that can be manipulated or hyperinflated, the supply of them became hyperinflated because as people who could produce these things realized very quickly that other people wanted them or they could be exchanged for real goods and services, they sought to hyperinflate that supply. In fact, that's precisely what happened. As I mentioned earlier, the rice stone. This rice stone was a great medium of exchange, great store of value, great best unit of account. And it was limited in supply, meaning limestone at the time was very, very difficult to quarry. It was in limited supply. And in order to create more, you had to go dig it up. Well, Europeans developed tools such as dynamite and other mining tools to extract this limestone from quarries much easier, and they hyperinflated the supply, and they used it to purchase goods and services from these individuals. So once again, if you demand soft money, and it's a relative term, if you demand soft money in exchange for goods and services, you will get wrecked, right? That's the lesson here. That's often my lesson. And the same thing happened. Yes, yeah. Wait, I think you're muted, Kathy.
This is so fascinating, and you're really laying a great groundwork for Bitcoin and how it's come to exist. I just want to make sure we don't run out of time. And
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we're coming quickly into the United States. And how does the United States come into that picture, right? So over time, gold becomes the dominant form of money because it serves these functions the best, right? And if you get a chance, I don't really have time to show it today, but there's this thing called the goldsmith's tale. And there's a little video called Money as Debt. And while I'm not endorsing that video, the first 20 minutes of that video have a great little cartoon that explains the goldsmith's tale and a lot of this history. And so since I don't have too much time to get into it, let's just fast forward to gold becomes the dominant, most hard form of money on the planet, right? So over time, what these goldsmiths, this kind of comes in through the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution kind of coincides with the founding of our nation, right? And the writing of our Constitution. And what these goldsmiths do is they ultimately become bankers, and they start taking on deposit gold and issuing banknotes. And what banknotes are just claim checks for the gold that's sitting in the vault, because it turns out over time, gold is very heavy, it's cumbersome, it's very difficult to divide for small transactions. So they start depositing at these banks, and these banks begin to issue claim checks or banknotes, right? And there's by the time in the late 1800s, by the time the late 1800s come, there's about 2,000 to 3,000 private banks in the United States. Some are owned by railroads. Actually, some of them are state banks. Some are owned by railroads. Some are owned by private companies. Most of them are private companies. And what they're doing is they're taking gold on deposit and they're issuing banknotes, their own banknotes. Now, if you settled in the town of Deadwood and you were a gold miner there and you deposited gold in the Bank of Deadwood, and then you tried to take your, travel out to San Francisco to buy some goods and services there, they would probably say, I don't really want these Bank of Deadwood notes, right? I want Bank of San Francisco notes or whatever, or Bank of Railroad, whatever notes. And so Wells Fargo, their little logo is the stagecoach. At that time, it's kind of like the Knights of the Templar. What they needed to do is move that value. So they would go down and deposit, exchange their banknotes at the bank for gold and pay somebody to take that gold and deposit it in another institution somewhere across the country if they wanted to move out there or exchange goods and services there. And that's kind of inefficient, right? So certainly this can be kind of cumbersome. We don't have a one true currency in the United States, right? But all of these banks are effectively taking on deposit gold and silver and issuing currency, right? But they are a trusted third party, okay? Now, they are actually creating more, they're operating, I don't have too much time to explain this, but they're operating under what's called a fractional reserve. Now, a fractional reserve is not in and of itself the devil per se, although a lot of people would tell you it is. It just means that the bank has a fraction of its commodity money, of the gold on deposit, and they're issuing out maybe 2 to 1, 4 to 1, maybe 10 to 1 banknotes for credit. So if I wanted to buy a house or something like that, or build a car, or create something of value, I would go down to the bank, they would give me a loan, and they would issue credit backed by that a fraction of gold, right? And as I would repay it back, the bank and its depositors would earn interest off of my payments back to the bank. Now, if everyone went down to the bank at the same time and tried to withdraw their gold, they would have what's called a bank run, okay? And that would be bad, right? So a number of reasons like this, over time, so does that, Hamilton and Jefferson, right? Let's talk a little bit about Hamilton and Jefferson. I got to make sure I do enough Constitution stuff here.
Well, Brandon,
So, yeah.
Brandon, we only have like 17 minutes left, and we need.
Oh, I can knock it out. I got it. You're thinking why?
No, it's not 17 for you. We need Jewel and Jordan to get in and ask their questions, and then we need audience questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll stay a few minutes over. I'll stay, absolutely, not a problem. So you're sitting here going like, okay, I get it, but why not? Where's Bitcoin in all this? I promise you, Bitcoin's actually just an iteration of this. Basically, at the founding of the country, right, there was no central bank. There was no federal bank. And Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson argue about this quite extensively. And if you have the chance to see one of our Constituting America debates between Hamilton and Jefferson, this is primarily the focus of that debate. And Hamilton believes very much that the federal government, at this newly created Constitution in 1787, should have the ability to do what all these private and state banks are doing, that they should have deposits at the Treasury and issue a federal banknote. Okay, and they actually do this in 1787 is the Constitution. 1791 is the creation of the first Bank of the United States. Okay, and if you get to take our trip, if you're a winner and you get to take our trip to Philly, it's right there on the tour. It's right next to Constitutional Hall, right? Like everything that's debated in government, there is compromise, right? So the people who they grant it with a 20-year charter, okay, and it actually they give it till 1811, okay. In 1811, its charter comes up for renewal, and it doesn't make it, okay. And then for another 4 years, it's debated in Congress again, and they established the second Bank of the United States in 1816. And both these banks do exactly what I just said. They take on deposit gold and silver, and they issue federal banknotes, okay? But they're still private banks, they're still state banks, they're still corporate banks, and a couple thousand of them. And they exist up through the late 1800s. And what happens here is, again, another charter is granted for 20 years from 1816 to 1836. And anybody know who president was in 1836?
Was it Jackson?
It was Jackson, which is ironic that he's on the 20, right? In fact, most of the people that are on our Federal Reserve banknotes hated central banking. So it's like an ironic joke, if you will, to some of these individuals. So Jackson, supposedly his last dying words were, "I killed the bank." And it was the last time that we were out of debt. It was the last time we, I mean, we've run surpluses since then, but we were last time that our government was out of debt. And we actually ran a surplus of, I think, of $1 million, okay, last time. So fast forward, and we don't actually have any other banks in the United States, federal banks. Lincoln issues greenbacks. He circumvents the central bankers. There's a lot of conspiracy theories there we won't get into, but it's not until the late 1800s. And if you have a chance, here's another book to read. This is a difficult one. The History of Money and Banking in the United States. And it is by Rothbard, I believe. History of Money and Banking in the United States. And he goes into great detail, all of this. And if he also goes into great detail about the rise of experts, which many of you were dealing with right now. It's funny how the more things more things change, the more they stay the same. The rise in experts, re-COVID and all that kind of stuff, that began with the rise in experts for central banking. And a lot of these state educational institutions and these economic journals were established by large bankers in order to promote the idea of creating a central bank. And they try to create a central bank. And finally, with the 16th Amendment in 1913, they established two things. They established the Federal Reserve Bank, and they also established the income tax, the ability for the federal government to levy income tax. And the reason they do this is they basically, they become the issuance of reserve bonds. Like when we don't really buy war bonds anymore. In other words, the government does not ask us to permission to go to war by raising money through taxes or war bonds anymore. What it does is it goes down to the Federal Reserve Bank and says, hey, I want to go fight a war, loan me some money, okay? And the Federal Reserve Bank says, here you go. And you became, as an individual, you became a co-signer on that loan without permission, right? So a few very interesting things that our constitutional scholars will talk to you about during these, what they call progressive amendments, 16th through the 19th Amendment, all happen very quickly, and they all happen, and they all coincide some way with the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank and how, and the fundamental nature in which our federal government interacts with you as an individual. And you know, I don't want to comment for the better or the worse, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So 1913, anybody know what happened in 1914?
Was that when we left the gold standard, or was that when?
No, so we're on the gold standard.
70. So that was the
we get engaged in a little conflict.
Island, is that Jekyll Island?
Yeah, so the prior to Jekyll Island is where all the bankers got together, and they helped push for the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. But a little skirmish you might have heard of, started in 1914, and that's World War I. And the reason that arguably became a world war is, for the first time, our federal government didn't really have to ask permission to fund it. So they used the Federal Reserve Bank to print more dollars than there was gold in that vault. And this is exactly what Jefferson was talking about when he was debating Hamilton. He said the federal government will always have this incentive to print or pressure the bank to print more money than exists in the vault, and allow them to grow, right? And so you understand, like, in those debates, Jefferson is very limited, small federal government. Hamilton is very powerful federal government, expansionist and all that. And that's exactly how this all ties in to gold. So again, I'm sitting here rambling about the history of money and on and on and on. When do I get to hear about Bitcoin? Tell me to go where to buy it or whatever. No, you need to understand how money how our relationship with money throughout history of mankind and also throughout the history of the United States has fundamentally shaped who we are and how we behave and what we do and our time preference and all of those things. Bitcoin is just the next iteration of that. The problem that so let's tie it back to Bitcoin. The problem that we have now is that we have a global economic society. We are reliant upon global supply chains, right? To live, to exist, in order to purchase goods and services and eat food. And what we need is money, sound money, hard money, right? That protects the privacy of the individual, that you can choose to reveal whether or not you are, Bitcoin has attributes that no other form of cash has. That is, you can spend it anonymously, where the one party does not know who the other party is, or at a later point in time. Unlike any other currency that has ever existed in the history of mankind, I can choose to reveal myself later. In other words, I could, for all of our listeners, we could go donate Bitcoin to the Constituting America, right? Anonymously. And then 10 years from now, our friends could say, you're a big jerk. You never donated any money to any worthy cause. And I could say, yes, I did. And I could sign a digital transaction and thus prove at a later point in time. Now, let's take it back to more practical constitutional stuff. Let's say, so one of the big things right now is civil asset forfeiture, or the theft of private property. And this has grown out of, this kind of grew out of the Reagan administration to fight drug cartels, but it's been used, it's been abused by state and local governments in order to steal private property from individuals, and requires them to show that prove that the property is theirs. So with Edward Snowden, we've seen things like that using of metadata. These bring in all sorts of constitutional questions of violating your rights. In other words, can the government find the crime that fits you instead of prove that you fit the crime? So let's say, basically using metadata, I can prove that you are anywhere I want you to be to have committed any crime that I wanted you to do. And that's a very dangerous thing. That's a very dangerous power for the government to have, right? So the cool thing about Bitcoin is you could actually choose to sign a transaction at a later point in time and say, no, I was actually over here. Even though I didn't want to reveal that information previously, I could reveal it at a later point in time. So Bitcoin does all these cool things. Basically, I'm gonna have to skip through some of it, but basically, Bitcoin is just a protocol. It was a culmination of these ideas and these desires and the fear. This group called the cypherpunks basically said, hey, we're really worried about the growing power increasingly over the last 100 years that the government has the ability to use its seigniorage of the money supply to do some very undesirable things that are not aligned with our founding fathers' vision of the Constitution, okay? And so basically in 2008, 2007, 2008, an anonymous person that we call Satoshi Nakamoto released the first code for Bitcoin and began mining it immediately afterwards, right? And it's completely open source. Anybody can add to it. And in 2010, that we had the first exchange for 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. It's basically these days that's a lot of money. And over the last 10 years, it has steadily gained popularity, right? And all it does is effectively create a public ledger that cannot be manipulated or edited or changed by anyone. And it takes that power away from private banks and from especially from governments and their ability to limit what you're allowed to do, right? Which is kind of the whole when we founded the Constitution. I'm trying to tie this more into the Constitution. The idea of the Constitution was that there were these negative rights. In other words, it was what the government couldn't do to you or could not tell you to do, right? It was It was in line with what Adam Smith saw as why economies grew: protection of private property rights, not interfering with individuals, right? Not stealing. That couldn't quarter. If you look at all the first 10 amendments, can't quarter soldiers in your home. You can't. In other words, I can't violate your private property rights. I can't just rifle through your stuff and steal your private property without getting a warrant, or for no unreasonable searches and seizures. These were negative rights, what the government couldn't do to you, and slowly but surely, we've seen a lot of those rights erode, and Bitcoin is arguably a step in the opposite direction. At this point, I'm going to kind of open it up because I realize we're kind of running low on time, and I can just talk and talk and talk. But again, this is an easy book to knock out. If you want to get into the nitty gritty of Bitcoin, this has it. If you want to understand the history of money and banking, the Bitcoin Standard has it. If you want to understand Austrian monetary theory, the Bitcoin Standard has it. This is the one book that I just throw at people because there's so many good resources. Bitcoin.org has tons of more information, but really, if you want to get it, just go to those websites. You can download a wallet and you can start using it immediately. It's no harder than anything else. What I'm explaining today is, why does it have value? And why is it the hardest money on the face of the planet? A lot of people you probably want to ask me questions about NFTs or altcoins and stuff like that. I don't have time to get into that, but this book will explain. You'll know yourself, should you invest in those things or not, based on reading that. So any questions you guys have about Bitcoin or why?
Yeah,
Bitcoin?
so great to see you again, Brandon. It's been a little while.
Likewise.
I enjoyed everything that you just said, and it was cool to hear it all explained in that way. So one issue I've had talking to conservatives for years, really, and constitutionalists, is quite honestly the affinity, I guess, for our financial system from conservatives. Who,
the protection of it?
Well, yes, and basically that when I look at the Constitution, I look at what the Founding Fathers created, I can't find our financial system in it. And while I understand that Alexander Hamilton had this idea of a central bank, it was still pretty far from what we have today. So let me lay out what I mean. Is that's
a great example. That's a great point.
To me, Bitcoin could be the solution to this issue. We have fiat currency and fractional banking at the same time. And what I mean is that if there's no gold standard and there is nothing in a reserve, it's just the projection of the value of the money, but then the bank doesn't even have to have that money to loan out, it automatically creates an inequality and a difference of a change of property rights, because what gives that bank that right? And we know what gives them that right. It's just set it by the government.
Yeah.
But that is totally not, like, it's fabrication. And when people say, okay, well, even a gold value is a fabrication, I even have an issue with that, because gold is a real thing. And I believe in beauty, and humans have always.
So is Bitcoin, by the way.
So to say that gold does not have intrinsic value, I even have, so it's a metal. I have a slight issue with that. So,
audio equipment, electronics, it's got plenty of intrinsic value. I want to make a point that you made it here. Bitcoin also has intrinsic value because its technology is backed by the blockchain. And there are other things you can do with the blockchain other than use it for a transfer of Bitcoin. You can use it for smart contracts. You can use it for transfer of property rights. You can use it as a ledger, all sorts of different types of digital ledgers. So people who tell me Bitcoin doesn't have any intrinsic value, you're simply wrong. You're wrong, because I can do other things with it than use it for money. But your point about Hamilton is spot on, because Hamilton did not ever imagine a central, all empowering. I'm sure he would love it. Hamilton would be like, whoa, this is way better than I thought. Because the expansion, the ability for the federal government to grow in size, which he was very much a proponent of, I believe, it allows it to do that. But I don't think Hamilton ever mentioned, he imagined a bank, a federal bank that fit in with these state banks and private banks. So you're spot on with that. He never imagined that.
Let me ask, I'm going to jump in here. Brandon, how long can you stay? Because
let's stay like another, I'll push these students. I got students, they can wait. They can wait. I like another 10 minutes. Then I probably got to run down there, you know?
Okay, well, Jewel, why don't, if y'all have one more question, and then we want to also.
Let's do a couple more questions.
Few audience
Yeah, well,
questions. 'Cause
Yeah,
we got a
one
lot of
more would
audience questions too.
be built off that same thing. Is that then? Do you see Bitcoin as a possible? Okay, I'll try to wrap up all the question into one.
It's hard. It's hard. Right? There's so much I can talk about.
So there's this issue that I believe in, which is the issue of having a fiat currency and a fractional banking at the same time.
Yes.
And it seems as if it will not ever be changed from the inside, and the democratic process would be manipulated so that it can't happen with the current political landscape.
Yes.
So
it
needs to be pressurized from the outside.
Precisely.
Do you think that Bitcoin could be that pressure?
Yes, because Bitcoin is permissionless. It does not ask permission to exist. It just does. And it does for mathematical reasons. It is to quote Hayek, okay, it is a sly roundabout way of taking that power back. There's a lot of gold bugs out there who are they believe we can get back on a gold standard. We cannot. We cannot, because we know that the federal government will attempt to control it, and the federal government, or governments in general, will always, praxeology tells us that people behave purposefully, and people remember that individuals act purposefully and rationally, and they remember that corporations, because they're constantly complaining about Amazon acting rationally, right? Because they want to, they want to sell businesses want to sell things for the highest price and do the least amount of work. Go figure. You want to pay the lowest price and do the least amount of work. It's like somehow, but then they forget governments are an entity. Unions are an entity. All of these entities act rationally and purposefully in their own, our politicians act rationally and purposefully, both in their protection of themselves and getting reelected, and also in the protection of the state, which is their lifeblood. And without that job, most of these politicians offer no real value, and they can't go back into the private sector. So they will do anything to protect the state and their goals they want to achieve with it. And so why would any government give up the power of seigniorage? They will not. They're not going to do it. We don't go, pretty please, government, will you please give us our hard money back? They're not going to do it. And so Bitcoin takes that by force without asking. It is permissionless. And that's precisely what it does. So, and if it doesn't work, I mean, I don't know. It was a great experiment. Will it work? I don't know. But it seems to be working so far. It seems to be a black hole that is sucking value out of equity markets and out of monetary markets and so on. And it seems to be taking a lot of ability away from these governments to do what they're doing by manipulating monetary supplies.
Yeah.
Thank you. Those are good questions.
So, Brandon, one of our listeners, Stan Hughes, says that if you could try to just maybe explain, like in 30 seconds or a minute,
I'll try.
What is Bitcoin and why does it have value?
Okay, so that's basically what I was trying to explain is, so Bitcoin is the world's first decentralized digital currency. It is a ledger, just like there's a ledger down at Wells Fargo that has track of all of their customers and how many dollars they have in their accounts, right? And when you write a check or send a Zelle to somebody, they debit one and credit the other. It's just a ledger. Bitcoin is just a ledger. It's a ledger that if you want to participate, you go and you download a Bitcoin wallet and you have a copy of it. Everybody, this is slightly more complicated than this, but for all intents and purposes, everybody who uses Bitcoin has a copy of the ledger. Instead of just Wells Fargo having the copy of the ledger, everybody does. But instead of having everybody's names written on that ledger, they just have these little addresses that aren't associated with anyone until you choose to. Now you can accidentally, Bitcoin is as anonymous as you want it to be. You can be very, I don't know, you can use it very foolishly, I guess you could say, or you could be very revealing if you could reveal yourself without knowing, I guess I should say. So you kind of need to educate yourself on it if you want to remain private, but it can be private. It can be very cash-like. And everybody has a copy of this ledger. And all it is just sending Bitcoins from one address to another address. And the reason those Bitcoins have value is because they all these functions of money, Bitcoin is better at a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account than any other currency on the planet. Better than gold, better than dollars, better than anything. In fact, you've been told over the last several years, you're like, I keep hearing about this Internet of Things. When's the Internet of Things gonna, it's kind of like flying cars. When are we gonna have flying cars? The reason we don't have an Internet of Things is because we don't have a currency that's conducive to that. In other words, my toaster can't buy a fraction of electricity from your solar panels, or your electric car can't buy internet from my drone that's flying around, because we don't have a currency that's really, it's cumbersome. There's high fees. There's, so Bitcoin is a base layer protocol. Lightning Network is a protocol on top of that. And eventually what we will have is a very efficient ledger that serves the medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value better than any other form of currency on the planet, and allows for very efficient transactions in very small micro amounts or large amounts across the planet at the speed of light. So that's what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is an iteration. It is the best money in the known universe, and that's why it has value.
Okay,
Yep.
I want to get in a question from one of our great supporters, Mrs. Reinsch. And Mrs. Reinsch writes, when Brandon defended Bitcoin as having intrinsic value, just like gold, it sounded like he was actually attributing the intrinsic value to blockchain, not to Bitcoin itself. Can this be clarified? But then Mrs. Reinsch also goes on to say, following up, he says that Bitcoin is a ledger, just like Wells Fargo has a ledger of its customers' money. Isn't blockchain the ledger to track Bitcoin, just like Wells Fargo's ledger spreadsheets are used to track digital dollars?
So basically the blockchain is a series of updates to the ledger. So every 10 minutes, imagine working on an Excel spreadsheet, and you want to make changes to it, but you want to be able to go back to old versions of it. So you might keep saving new versions of it. Every 10 minutes, the Bitcoin blockchain is updated. So and all the new transactions are written in it. And that is each one of those blocks is basically that Excel spreadsheet back in time, all the way back to the Genesis block, the very beginning block, which I believe was on, well, it doesn't really matter. There's some constitutional knowledge I would like to drop in there, but we don't have time for it. So basically you have the blockchain is basically the base layer protocol of what allows Bitcoin to function. So Bitcoin, a lot of these bankers will say, oh, I love blockchain, but I don't like Bitcoin. Well, blockchain doesn't exist without Bitcoin. Blockchain doesn't exist without a token, a incentive compatible structure that incentivizes people to keep the blockchain alive, because there's no central server. There's no bank of Bitcoin. There's no CEO of Bitcoin. There's no servers. It's running on millions of computers across the planet of people that would probably otherwise hate each other, that come together to run these incentives align to run this thing. And so without Bitcoin, there is no blockchain. So they are effectively, for all intents and purposes, one and the same. And because of that, the blockchain itself is probably what you would say definitively has the intrinsic value, but blockchain doesn't exist without Bitcoin, and Bitcoin doesn't exist without blockchain. So it's kind of one and the same.
Now here's maybe just a quick question. John Chambers asked, if you have a wallet from Bitcoin, can you put Ethereum or some other crypto in it?
Okay. So no, there are some wallets out there that, and I don't want to get to download this wallet or don't download that wallet on this particular one, but I do want to point you to resources where you get the answers to those things. The answer is yes, there are some wallets that store multiple coins. And since I'm not a financial advisor, and since I'm not here to push Bitcoin over any other particular asset, I want you to go read this book. It is not mine. I don't get any financial anything. The author of it, Saifedean Ammous, actually helped pirate it on his own Twitter. If you want to go, but I strongly suggest you support the author. But this book will tell you why or why not you should invest in Bitcoin versus alternative cryptocurrencies. But the reason I was trying to lay the foundation of what is hard money today was, best medium of exchange, best store of value, best unit of account. If you want to understand why the British Empire got wrecked, it's because the British pound sterling was their reserve currency. And once we started discovering that when silver and gold used to be at parity with one another, that wasn't a problem. But as we started discovering larger deposits of silver, easier ways of refining it, it became a lot of silver got dumped onto the market, right? And holders of gold, i.e. holders of harder money versus people who are holding softer money, the softer money got wrecked. So what I want you to do is go read this book, and you'll understand, should you be buying any of those NFTs or tulips or anything else, that you'll be able to answer that question on your own. But if you want to go research different wallets, bitcoin.org or Bitcoin, bitcoin.org has a bunch of different wallets on it.
I've got to run, but
yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Great. Hopefully we can talk about it again. Thanks, Kathy. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to email me if you have questions. It's brandon.vanderford@uta.edu. And I will do my best.
And Brandon, if I could, maybe I'll just type that in here. Let's see, brandon.vanderford@uta.edu. Okay, so because we did have some other questions we didn't get to, but I know you've got to get down the hall to teach your class, and we thank you so much for being with us today. It was fascinating.
Thanks for having me. And hopefully you learned why it has value. Hopefully you learned a little bit about history in the United States. The thing is, we can just talk for hours. We could go into the Federal Reserve Bank. We could go into Executive Order 6102 with FDR. If you have a chance, go check out Executive Order 6102. And slowly but surely you realize that we've boiled the frog. We've reduced that fraction of gold down, 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 down. And as Jewel was saying, turned it into a fraction, not just a fractional reserve, but a fractional reserve of fiat currency, where all of our currency is no longer backed by any commodity, but it is backed by debt. And that is probably very different from what the founding fathers imagined when they wrote the Constitution. And it has changed fundamentally how we interact with our government and with our Constitution.
And you have a friend, Matt Wallace, who wanted to be sure and say hi and tell you for mentioning Jackson. So we will let you go teach your class, and we invite everybody back next week for our new series. We're going to be talking about foreign policy and the Constitution. And next week, we'll talk about the founders and foreign policy. So join us next week, Tuesday at 2. And thank you so much, Brandon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.